Okay, much better. We have Lizzie, who's a Director for Carbon Market Developments at Standard Chartered Bank. We have Susana, who's GM for Sustainability and Decarbonisation at Swire Bulk and Swire Shipping, and Erlend Engelstad, who's Head of Commercial for Asia at the European Energy Exchange. So, as just mentioned, as I'm sure most of you in this room already know, the European Union voted earlier this year to extend the EU ETS scheme to include maritime. So it effectively establishes a system for greenhouse gas emission allowances for trading within the EU. And it's going to take effect from 1st of January 2024, although there will be a phased introduction. And the system is going to cover 100% of emissions for voyages starting and ending within the EU, and 50% of emissions for those voyages that either start or end outside the EU. And it will apply to large vessels, which are vessels categorized as having a gross tonnage of 5,000 or more, and which are transporting cargo or passengers for commercial purposes. So from a lot of sectors of the maritime industry, the concept of having some kind of carbon trading platform has been welcomed. Certainly when we look at the analysis that we did in the Sustainability Imperative, which was a report that Watson, Farley and Williams published earlier this year, an overwhelming majority of people said they thought that some kind of carbon trading and carbon credits was important, if not critical, for achieving energy transition to net zero. But I guess the question is EU ETS the solution? Because it's certainly not been without its critics. So I'm very keen to hear the thoughts of my fellow panelists. Perhaps, Lucy, you can start us off. Are you pleased to see that maritime has been included in the EU ETS?
Well, it's definitely going to be a challenge for the industry. I've been talking about this for a few years now, and it's only really starting to gain traction in terms of people are starting to take notice, and as a result, the registries are overwhelmed, and there's a lot of confusion, and it's only starting, it's 3 months' time it's starting. But the whole reason that shipping has been brought into the EU ETS is because the EU don't believe that the IMO are doing enough to decarbonise the industry. So they've taken a stance. They've been trying to get shipping into it for years and years, and it's already been pushed back twice. It was meant to start in 2022, and it's been pushed back twice. So it is coming, and it undoubtedly won't get delayed again. It's going to be a challenge, especially for a lot of ship owners who aren't used to these sorts of markets. But it is being brought into a very, airlines were brought into the EU ETS in a slightly separate scheme, and hasn't worked as seamlessly as perhaps it could have done. So shipping coming into the EU ETS as a very robust mechanism it's not a bad thing. It's going to take a lot of time to get used to, but it is a better way for shipping to be brought into the EU ETS under the framework of a very, very robust mechanism that's been going since 2005.
I mean, interesting that you're mentioning some of the challenges, and I think maybe we can come back to that a bit later on, because I think that there are definitely some issues that we can dive into a bit later. Susana, maybe coming from the owner-operator perspective, are you sort of in agreement? Is this a positive development? And in particular, are there any sort of concerns around shipping companies having actual visibility in terms of knowing the emissions and managing it? Is it all good?
Well, I think that saying that is all good is a little bit of an understatement. It is not all good yet, but I do think that there is a very, very clear path to go about it. First, as Lucy said, it would not make any sense to put it anywhere else but within the existing framework of the EU ETS. It is, it's been applicable since 2005. They are liquid markets. They are very, very clear frameworks. And if we tried to adapt and have a EU ETS outside the existing scope, I think it would be another 5 to 10 years until it is actually finished. So I think that it is a good thing. And it is important to level the play field. Like you said, IMO was not moving fast enough. Maybe this was the bump that IMO needed to come up with MEPC 80 new targets. From a visibility point of view, all companies that are calling Europe, they have been reporting to UMRV since 2018, so 5 years of data. So all you have to do is actually go, if you are in an operations part, or in the commercial parties, go and talk to your technical team that has been submitting that data, and you will have a very, very clear understanding of what your costs are going to be. So I think that what is a little bit different in the way that is proposed is that most of the regulations, or in general, they are technical regulations, and all environmental regulations include, a commercial operations and a technical part. So this is the part that is going to take a little bit for people to get used to. I do think that small shipping companies will struggle, but it is out of not being able to have the resources to actually put into what the process will require. But I don't think that any of the large companies will have any trouble in complying.
So in effect, we could end up with a bit of a two-stream system where there's a large advantage for the larger companies, particularly where they may already have more experience in this area, and it will be the smaller owners who need to play catch-up to an extent. And Erlend, just on this first topic about whether it's a positive to see shipping introduced into the EU ETS, also love to hear your thoughts, particularly in the context of the fact that I know Lucy was mentioning she thinks it's better shipping's come into an existing regime, but obviously EU ETS was not designed for shipping, and I understand that from an administrative perspective that actually including shipping is going to end up with something like double the number of participants. So do you think that the industry and the framework is ready?
Well, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. I guess just to give you a full disclosure, I guess, so we obviously are not compliance buyers in the European Union. However, we do run the emissions auctions that are the originators of all the EUAs that are being used for compliance in the EU. We also happen to run a freight derivatives market, which means that we have, or we see ourselves as big stakeholders in the shipping industry. And I'll just echo what Lucy said as well, which is that I think the end result for big companies in this industry will be a much easier, or there will be a much easier route to market for them than it would be for smaller owners. I think just the merits of the ETS has worked, so we know that the ETS has served its policy purpose. Emissions are down since 2005 by about 43%, and with increasing demands on decarbonization, the EU has many tools in their toolbox, one of which is to extend the scope of emissions. And while shipping is a smaller part of the EU total emissions footprint, we obviously, as an exchange, also think that we support the development of including shipping. On the administrative side, I think we see our shipping customers, in particular smaller ones, struggling somehow to set up registry accounts, getting acquainted with essentially as a financial product. Under MiFID rules in Europe, EUAs are considered financial products, so it requires a lot of prep work for the shipping industry to enter that market if they haven't set up that infrastructure before.
Okay. I mean, the decrease in 43% is quite astounding, so obviously does show that there is a benefit. I mean, I guess that brings me on to my next question. Susana, do you think in practice that actually EU ETS is going to have a noticeable effect, and are people going to actually change their operational strategies, or is it just a additional tax that has to be paid somehow.
Tax, really. Unfortunately, we have done the calculations for the vessels that we have calling Europe, and at the moment the premium for using of biofuels, because there is really not any option available, it is higher to use biofuels than to actually pay for the EU allowances. So actually is not really motivating for the next couple of years any uptake of fuels. And on top, there are several issues with the biofuels that I will talk about. What I do think that is going to make a difference in the future is Fuel EU, because that is a regulation that is totally designed for the uptake of new fuels. EU ETS is about tank-to-wake emissions within Europe. If we look at the solution of if we have a vessel calling Europe and you would like to use biofuels instead of paying for the emissions, like I said, not worth it at the moment, it is really a task, because at the moment, the lead time for taking biofuels is quite long. So if you're doing a very short trip, so I'm talking about not containers that you go nowhere to going, you're talking about tramping. If you do not know what ship is going to Europe, and if you do not know when you're going to call, it is impossible. There is no way at the moment to actually speed up the process of taking biofuels within 2 weeks, for example. So there is really no other solution apart from, pay the allowances. I think that also the problem is people tend to confuse the part of receiving emissions and passing emissions, because you will have to collect. So as an operator, you are in the middle of the chain. So you are collecting emissions or cash or whatever it is from your charterers, from your cargo interests, and you are then passing those to whatever vessel has fulfilled that voyage, has performed that voyage. But it is also important to remember that if you are, for example, loading somewhere, if you're discharging in Europe, you have a ballast leg out of Europe afterwards that you still have to pay emissions. So emissions are not cargo dependent, they are voyage dependent. And this is quite a new concept too, because you used to think of when do you start your voyage, when do you finish your voyage, and suddenly you have a cost that is associated to a voyage that you have just done past. So I think that this little bits will take a little bit of time for people to get used to, but I don't really see it from a trading point of view. You are passing it's a tax. You're passing a carbon tax to your cargo interests that then you will pass to the owners of the vessels that are performing it.
All right, that's interesting to hear. I mean, hopefully over time, as alternative fuels become slightly more competitively priced compared to traditional fuels, then maybe some of those calculations change and maybe the conversation changes, but certainly...
Fuel EU will make a change. So the moment that Fuel EU will arrive, and it is a much more complicated regulation that I know it is not about this, but it will start on 1st of January 2025. So we are, next year we will be talking about Fuel EU here, because it is in base of energy, and actually it benefits the uptake of fuel. So, while EU ETS is completely blind about the well-to-tank emissions, well-to-wake, Fuel EU applies well-to-wake, and if you have, for example, a vessel that is modern and efficient and using conventional fuels, and if you have an old vessel that is not modern, not efficient, but you use biofuels, you will pay a penalty on the new tonnage, not on the old one. So it is really designed to promote the adoption of fuels, not the EU ETS.
Right. Well, I'm looking forward to next year's panel when we can discuss that. But just bring it back to EU ETS for now. So the EU has announced that the actual acts which are required to implement and adopt EU ETS will actually only be published at the end of this year. And as we were discussing last week on our prep call, there's still ongoing consultation around the text in respect of who should actually be responsible for submitting the emissions allowances to the administering authority. So I'm curious, are there concerns about the actual status of implementation currently, thinking about the fact it's going to start from 1st of January next year? I mean, Lucy, maybe you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is the main challenge that all our clients, especially in this part of the world, are facing. If you're a non-EU entity, opening a registry account is basically impossible. Malta and Cyprus were open for non-EU entities, or it was easier to open them, and they have closed their applications for new accounts because they've been overwhelmed. Actually, I had a call with the EC on Monday night about these specific topics. They confirmed that the legislation, the draft legislation that's currently open for public consultation, is now putting the default liability on the registered owner, with the option to then outsource that liability to the DOC holder. So that is a big U-turn from where it was always on the DOC holder. This was a lot of pushback from especially ship managers who were then going to be taking on this huge liability, but without the responsibility of the cost and how they manage that. So that draft legislation, I think it finishes tomorrow, so there'll be more information about that. But yeah, opening registries, we put that question to them. We said to the EU, we said, you know, what can clients out here do if they can't open a registry account? And they said there's basically no option apart from buying forwards and futures, which isn't an option for a lot of people. Playing that with a lot of people very new to these markets. So if you can't open a maritime operating holding account, which is the compliance account, which you can only open from next year, and will take about 60 business days to open. If you wanted to start taking spot delivery of these EUAs, you've got nowhere to put them until basically mid-next year. The EU's reply was that, well, you don't have to surrender until September 25, but that's not really a very commercial option for a lot of players in the market. So, you know, we are working in-house on maybe some options that we can offer to our clients for this issue, but yeah, it is a big problem out here on the registry, which I'm sure Susana and Erlend can also add to.
All right. I mean, just before we go on to the next thing, and maybe, Erlend, you can speak a bit about the point around the futures trading. We do actually, at Watson Farley, have a team specifically looking at this and the ability to have one of our European officers appointed as registered agent to help with that. So I'm not going to go into that on this panel, but if anyone is interested, please do come and speak to me later. So now that plug is over, Erlend, maybe you can tell us a bit about what you're seeing with some of your clients in terms of the future trading that Lucy had mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a good example, I spent a week in Taiwan just a couple of weeks ago in front of an audience like this, where every single question I got was how to access the registry services. And as Lucy said, it's been a tough one for non-EU participants to access. I think as an exchange that also runs some of these markets, we have similar constraints because our rule books and member access to different markets also depends on EU regulation, which means that we are currently not even able to onboard a customer outside of the EU who wishes to trade in the primary auction for EUAs. There are some options, I think Lucy alluded to them as well. Essentially, you could trade in the futures market, even the spot market, if you access a regulated marketplace. How you would do that is to use the exchange's own escrow accounts and essentially use that as a holding account or a virtual holding account on your own behalf or under one of your financial intermediaries, where you don't need a registry account to build up an inventory of EUAs. There are other benefits, I guess, of coming into the financial markets for some of these initial trading of EUAs that you require. EUAs can be used as collateral even if you have a bigger derivatives portfolio, such as freight hedging and so forth. But what we argue for our customers is essentially first port of call would be to get in touch with your intermediary or your bank typically and ask whether or not they can be custodians of positions that you aggregate in the short term, and then pass those positions onto your registry account when that system is ready. As I said at the beginning as well, a lot of our customers already have access to the financial infrastructure that is, underpinning all of these markets, which means that we do have a route to market in lieu of being able to set up registry accounts at the moment.
Okay. And that's very helpful to know. I'm sure a lot of people find that very useful. Just before we move off the topic of uncertainty, Susana, I saw you pick up your microphone when we were first mentioning the question. I'm sure you have a few thoughts to add. So.
I think you cannot underestimate what it is, the difficulties of actually complying with a regulation that does not exist yet, because this is actually what is happening. So, you know, the way the process goes is the EU has a directive, all of the, sorry, good thing I have a
voice that can be heard, yeah. So it is, you know, if you understand the process, so it is a EU directive that will have to be adopted by all of the member states, and it has, you know, within the EU directive is obviously everything fit for 55, it includes transport, it includes, you know, other areas, and then each country will have to pick up that EU directive and legislate in their own member states of how is that regulation going to look like. So what we're actually discussing is, Lucy was mentioning, we're still in consultation to understand who has to surrender those allowances. Until you know who surrenders those allowances, you can't open the account that will be the registry account that will be surrendering those allowances. So you have to think, okay, what am I going to do until then? You know, let's open a trading account, like Lucy said, you know, Malta and Cyprus completely closed. I just got an email from Germany saying that, sending it in German too, that was very helpful. So there is difficulties in the opening, but what is really the difficulty is ship owners are expected to comply with the regulation that does not exist yet. And we will have to start collecting, you know, whatever liabilities we have from cargo interest from the 1st of January. And if we don't have the clarity of how each one of the member states is going to elaborate on that legislation, it is a really, really difficult task. So that is one of the massive challenges that I see at the moment.
Okay. I just got told about 2 minutes ago we only had 2 minutes left, but I want to squeeze in one very last question. But if you can give just a 30-second answer each, and then we'll wrap up. I just wanted to come on to the money element. We're obviously here at Marine Money. One of the criticisms of the regulations is that in the earlier drafts, it was contemplated around 75% of the revenue from the maritime EU ETS would be reinvested in shipping. Based on the final wording, it now seems there will be an innovation fund, but it's going to be a much, much smaller portion that goes back to shipping. If you had the power in 30 seconds or less, how would you spend that money within shipping, and how much of the money do you think should go back to shipping? Lucy, go.
On the spot. I can't allude to the percentage, but I think ultimately people would want to see it go back into research and development of future, much like the Fuel EU maritime funds are going back into trying to build the infrastructure for the future fuels in the EU. I think that's ultimately where the ship-owning community would like to see this money going. In reality, we'll see what the economic situation is. But yeah.
Susana, 30 seconds.
Well, I'm not very confident about this innovation fund either. I was actually reading a bit about it, and you know, it goes back, so the innovation fund goes back to each one of the member states that then can decide what to do with it. So it could disappear in, you know, I don't know, planting something special, or, you know, so I don't see any money going back to shipping, and that is very, very concerning. It should be used in infrastructure, it should be using in promoting the manufacturing of fuels, and everything that port infrastructure needs severe updates, and it should start with that. It's not going to go, that is a pity.
And Erlend?
Yeah, no, well, same from me. I think infrastructure in ports, of course, both on the electrification, you know, the bunkering facilities, getting the cost curve down for renewable fuels, massively important, of course, and then also, of course, providing sufficient support on technology innovation for more efficiency in the ships themselves. I think on the fuel side, you know, there should be essentially a policy mix from the EU. There could be lessons learned from the European energy market as a whole, creating certificates markets for fuels, capacity mechanisms, using CFDs to subsidize fuel supply and ensure offtakes, and many different tools in the box that they should be looking at. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Would love to be able to spend some more time chatting with you guys. I know there's a few other topics we wanted to cover, but I am conscious of the time. So wrap up now. But if anyone is interested in discussing this more, then please do come and approach myself or any of the panelists, because we're all very happy to talk on this topic. I think the main takeaway is the regulations are not perfect, there's still not enough clarity, but at the end of the day, it's probably better than nothing, probably better than waiting for the IMO, and it is happening, so people do need to prepare. Thank you very much.